Captain Marcus Rodriguez had seen it all in his 15 years flying commercial aircraft. From nervous first-time flyers to celebrities trying to travel incognito, nothing surprised him anymore. At least that's what he thought as he walked through the busy terminal at Denver International Airport on that crisp October morning. The flight to Miami was scheduled to depart in 2 hours, and Marcus always arrived early to review flight plans and weather conditions. His routine was sacred: coffee first, then a thorough check of the aircraft, followed by a briefing with his crew. Today felt no different from the hundreds of other flights he had commanded. As he approached Gate B-12, Marcus noticed the usual pre-flight activity. Ground crew members were loading luggage, fuel trucks were positioned near the aircraft, and maintenance personnel were conducting their final inspections. The familiar sight of orange safety vests and blue uniforms moving around the plane always gave him a sense of comfort. These people were the unsung heroes who made aviation possible. Walking up the jet bridge, Marcus spotted a figure in a standard airline uniform standing near the aircraft door. From behind, the person appeared to be just another crew member. Average height, dark hair pulled back neatly, regulation uniform perfectly pressed. Nothing unusual there. The airline industry was filled with dedicated professionals who took pride in their appearance and work. Marcus was about to continue past when something made him pause. Years of military training before his commercial aviation career had taught him to notice details that others might miss. There was something about the way this crew member stood, a certain posture that seemed different from typical airline personnel. It wasn't slouched or casual like someone who had been working long shifts. Instead, there was an almost military bearing to the stance. Curiosity getting the better of him, Marcus decided to introduce himself. After all, crew cohesion was important for flight safety, and he made it a point to know everyone working on his flights. As he approached, the crew member turned around, and Marcus found himself looking at a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with striking green eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately commanded respect. "Good morning," Marcus said with his usual friendly captain's smile. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I don't think we've met before." The woman extended her hand with a firm handshake that surprised Marcus with its strength. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied. "I'm working the Miami route today." There was something about her voice, clear, confident, with just a hint of authority that seemed beyond her apparent years. Marcus had worked with thousands of flight attendants, baggage handlers, and ground crew members over the years, and he had developed a sixth sense about people. Sarah Mitchell carried herself differently than typical airline personnel. As they spoke, Marcus found himself studying her uniform more closely. Everything appeared standard at first glance: the navy blue jacket, crisp white shirt, regulation tie, and the small wing pin that all airline employees wore. But then his eyes caught something that made his heart skip a beat. On Sarah's left shoulder was a small patch that definitely wasn't part of the standard airline uniform. It was subdued, designed to blend in, but Marcus's military background made him recognize it immediately. The patch showed a pair of silver wings with a star in the center, the unmistakable insignia of a military pilot. Not just any pilot, but one with significant experience and training. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't just any crew member. This was a fellow pilot, and based on the specific design of the patch, likely someone with combat experience. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Here he was, thinking he was talking to a regular airline employee, when in reality he was face to face with someone who had probably flown missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Sarah seemed to notice his recognition of the patch. A slight smile crossed her face, but she didn't say anything. There was an understanding that passed between them. The kind of silent communication that exists between pilots who have faced the ultimate responsibility of controlling aircraft under pressure. "That's an interesting patch," Marcus said carefully, not wanting to assume too much but unable to ignore what he was seeing. Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Thank you for noticing, Captain. Not many people do." The implications of her words began to sink in. If Sarah was wearing her pilot's wings on what appeared to be an airline uniform, there was definitely more to this story. Marcus had heard rumors about military pilots taking jobs with commercial airlines during their leave time or after their service, but he had never encountered one working in what appeared to be a ground crew position. "Are you—" Marcus began, then stopped himself. He realized he was making assumptions about her role without actually knowing what she was doing there. "Am I what, Captain?" Sarah asked, her green eyes sparkling with what looked like amusement at his confusion. Marcus felt slightly embarrassed. Here he was, a veteran commercial pilot stumbling over his words like a rookie. "I apologize," he said. "I just noticed your wings and I wasn't sure what capacity you were working in today." Sarah glanced around the busy gate area, where passengers were beginning to gather for boarding. "I think that conversation might be better suited for somewhere more private, Captain. There are aspects of my current assignment that aren't exactly standard operating procedure." The mystery was deepening by the minute. Marcus found himself more intrigued than he had been in years. What kind of assignment was Sarah talking about? Why was a qualified pilot working in what appeared to be an airline ground position? And why was she being so cryptic about her role? Before he could ask any more questions, the gate agent's voice came over the intercom, announcing the beginning of pre-boarding procedures. The moment for deeper conversation had passed, at least for now. "I should get back to my duties, Captain," Sarah said, "but perhaps we can continue this conversation during the flight." As she walked away, Marcus stood there trying to process what had just happened. In all his years of flying, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The professional pilot in him was curious about Sarah's background and qualifications. The former military man in him recognized a fellow service member, and the human being in him was simply fascinated by the mystery she represented. Looking at his watch, Marcus realized he needed to focus on his own pre-flight preparations. But as he headed toward the aircraft, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight to Miami was going to be anything but routine. Sarah Mitchell, whoever she really was, had just turned his ordinary Tuesday morning into something much more interesting. Marcus completed his pre-flight inspection with unusual distraction. Normally his routine was methodical and focused, but today his mind kept wandering back to Sarah Mitchell and that mysterious patch on her uniform. He had checked the weather reports, reviewed the flight plan, and examined every system on the aircraft, yet he couldn't concentrate fully on any of it. The Boeing 737 was in perfect condition, as he expected from the airline's maintenance crew. Everything from the engines to the navigation systems checked out flawlessly. But as Marcus moved through the cabin, he found himself looking for Sarah, wondering where she fit into the operation of this flight. His co-pilot, Jennifer Walsh, arrived 30 minutes before departure. Jennifer was a seasoned aviator with 8 years of commercial flying experience, and Marcus had flown with her many times before. She was thorough, professional, and had an eye for detail that made her an excellent second-in-command. "Morning, Marcus," Jennifer said as she settled into the right seat of the cockpit. "Beautiful flying weather today. Should be a smooth ride to Miami." "Good morning, Jen," Marcus replied, trying to focus on the standard pre-flight briefing. "Light winds, clear skies, no significant weather between here and Florida. Should be routine." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew this flight was already far from routine. As they worked through their checklists, he found himself glancing out at the gate area, looking for any sign of Sarah. The mystery of her presence was eating at him in a way that surprised him with its intensity. 20 minutes before departure, the flight attendants arrived for their briefing. Marcus recognized most of them. Patricia, a veteran with 20 years of experience. David, a newer hire who had been with the airline for 2 years. And Maria, who had worked this route many times before. They were a solid crew, the kind of professionals who made his job easier, but there was no sign of Sarah Mitchell. As the attendants took their positions for boarding, Marcus couldn't help but ask Patricia, "Did anyone mention an additional crew member working this flight today? Someone named Sarah Mitchell?" Patricia looked puzzled. "No, Captain. Just the regular crew today. Is there someone we should be expecting?" Marcus shook his head, more confused than ever. If Sarah wasn't part of the regular flight crew, what was she doing at the gate wearing an airline uniform? And more importantly, where was she now? Boarding began on schedule, and Marcus watched through the cockpit door as passengers filed onto the aircraft. Business travelers with their laptops and coffee cups, families with children and carry-on bags stuffed with entertainment, elderly couples moving slowly but purposefully down the aisle. It was the usual mix of humanity that filled commercial flights every day. Then about halfway through the boarding process, Marcus saw her. Sarah Mitchell was walking down the aisle, but she wasn't in her airline uniform anymore. Instead, she wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple white blouse, and a leather jacket that looked both stylish and practical. She carried a small backpack and moved with the same confident bearing he had noticed earlier. What really caught Marcus's attention was her seat assignment. Sarah wasn't sitting in coach with the majority of passengers, nor was she in the business class section at the front of the plane. Instead, she was heading toward seat 14A, which Marcus knew was positioned perfectly to observe both the cockpit door and the main cabin. It was exactly where someone would sit if they wanted to monitor the entire aircraft. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces of this puzzle were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't a picture he particularly liked. Sarah's military background, her mysterious presence at the gate, her strategic seating position, and her cryptic comments about her assignment were all starting to point toward one possibility that made his pilot's instincts go on high alert. Could Sarah Mitchell be some kind of air marshal? The thought made perfect sense and terrified him at the same time. Federal air marshals were highly trained law enforcement officers who flew undercover on commercial flights to protect against terrorist threats. They were typically former military or law enforcement personnel with extensive firearms training and combat experience. The description fit Sarah perfectly. But if Sarah was an air marshal, what did that mean for this particular flight? Air marshals weren't assigned to flights randomly. Their presence usually indicated some level of threat or security concern. Marcus had been briefed about air marshal procedures during his training, but he had never knowingly flown with one before. As the last passengers boarded and the flight attendants prepared for departure, Marcus tried to calm his racing thoughts. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe Sarah was just a former military pilot working for the airline in some capacity he didn't understand. Maybe her seating position was just coincidental, but his instincts told him otherwise. Jennifer noticed his distraction as they received clearance for pushback. "Everything okay, Marcus? You seem a little tense today." Marcus glanced back toward seat 14A, where he could see Sarah settling in for the flight. She appeared relaxed and casual, like any other passenger, but there was something about her alertness that seemed different from typical travelers. Her eyes were constantly moving, scanning the cabin and other passengers in a way that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual observation. "Just thinking about something unusual that happened at the gate," Marcus replied to Jennifer. "Probably nothing to worry about." But as they taxied toward the runway, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be anything but ordinary. If Sarah Mitchell really was an air marshal, her presence suggested that someone, somewhere, had reason to believe this particular flight might be a target for some kind of threat. The aircraft lifted off smoothly into the clear Denver sky, beginning its journey toward Miami. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Marcus found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every deviation from the normal routine of commercial flight. The professional pilot in him continued to fly the aircraft with his usual skill and precision. But another part of his mind remained focused on the mysterious passenger in seat 14A. During the initial climb, Marcus noticed Sarah's reflection in the window as she appeared to be casually reading a magazine. But her eyes weren't focused on the pages. They were watching the other passengers, the flight attendants, and occasionally glancing toward the cockpit door. Her behavior confirmed his suspicions even further. About an hour into the flight, as they leveled off at 37,000 feet, Marcus made a decision. He needed to know more about Sarah Mitchell and why she was really on his aircraft. The uncertainty was affecting his ability to focus on flying, and that was something he couldn't allow to continue. "Jen, can you take the controls for a few minutes?" Marcus asked. "I want to do a quick cabin check." Jennifer nodded, taking control of the aircraft as Marcus unbuckled his harness and stood up. Walking through the main cabin would give him a chance to observe Sarah more closely and perhaps get a better sense of what was really going on. Marcus walked through the cabin with practiced ease, nodding to passengers and checking with the flight attendants as he made his way toward the back of the aircraft. This type of cabin walk was routine for many captains. It helped maintain crew morale and gave passengers confidence in their flight's leadership. But today, Marcus had a very specific purpose in mind. As he approached row 14, he could see Sarah more clearly. She had positioned herself with a perfect view of the entire cabin, and her magazine was clearly just a prop. Her eyes were constantly moving, cataloging every passenger, every movement, every potential threat. When she noticed Marcus approaching, she looked up with a pleasant smile that any casual observer would interpret as normal passenger friendliness. "Captain Rodriguez," she said quietly as he paused near her seat. "How's the flight going?" "Smooth skies all the way to Miami," Marcus replied, keeping his voice equally low. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" He gestured to the empty middle seat next to her. Sarah nodded and Marcus settled into the seat, acutely aware that they were having a conversation that other passengers might overhear. He needed to be careful about what he said and how he said it. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the gate," Marcus began. "About your assignment." Sarah's green eyes studied his face carefully. "What exactly have you been thinking, Captain?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I'm wondering if there's anything about this particular flight that I should know about. As the pilot in command, passenger and crew safety is my responsibility." For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. Marcus could almost see her weighing her options, deciding how much she could or should reveal. Finally, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. She opened it briefly, just long enough for Marcus to see a federal badge and identification card that confirmed his suspicions. Federal Air Marshal Sarah Mitchell. The badge disappeared back into her jacket as quickly as it had appeared. "There's no immediate threat to this aircraft or its passengers," Sarah said quietly. "But there are reasons why additional security was deemed appropriate for this particular flight." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of reasons?" Sarah glanced around the cabin before answering. 3 days ago, intelligence sources intercepted communications suggesting that a domestic flight from Denver to Miami might be targeted for some kind of disruption. The threat assessment wasn't specific enough to ground flights or implement special security measures, but it was credible enough to warrant air marshal coverage. The implications of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Someone, somewhere, might be planning to do something to his aircraft, his passengers, his crew. The responsibility he felt as pilot in command suddenly felt much heavier. "Do you have any specific suspects on board?" Marcus asked. Sarah shook her head slightly. "The intelligence was too vague for that. It could be a passenger, it could be ground crew, it could be nothing at all. These kinds of threats often turn out to be false alarms or miscommunications, but we take them all seriously." Marcus looked around the cabin with new eyes. The businessman in 8C who had been typing frantically on his laptop since takeoff. Was he working on a presentation or something more sinister? The young man in 22B who had seemed nervous during boarding. Was he afraid of flying or planning something terrible? The elderly woman in 18A who kept checking her watch. Was she anxious about meeting family in Miami or timing something else entirely? "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked. "Just fly the plane normally," Sarah replied. "Don't change anything about your routine or procedures. If there is a threat on board, we don't want to alert anyone that we're aware of it. The best thing you can do is maintain normal operations while I continue to observe." Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing with questions. "Should I inform my co-pilot?" Sarah considered this for a moment. "Not unless it becomes absolutely necessary. The fewer people who know about my presence, the better. If something does happen, I'll identify myself to your crew immediately." Standing up to continue his walk through the cabin, Marcus felt the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on him. Every decision he made from this point forward could have consequences he couldn't even imagine. The simple flight from Denver to Miami had become something much more complex and potentially dangerous. As he made his way back toward the cockpit, Marcus tried to maintain his normal demeanor, but he found himself studying every passenger with suspicious eyes. The mother entertaining her young children in row 6 seemed innocent enough, but then again, terrorists had used families as cover before. The college students in row 12 who were laughing and sharing photos on their phones appeared harmless, but appearances could be deceiving. Returning to the cockpit, Marcus strapped himself back into the captain's seat and took control of the aircraft from Jennifer. "Everything okay back there?" Jennifer asked. "All normal," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Passengers seemed comfortable, crews doing well, but nothing felt normal anymore. As Marcus monitored the flight instruments and maintained radio contact with air traffic control, part of his attention remained focused on the cabin behind him. Every unusual sound, every movement by the flight attendants, every variation in passenger behavior now carried potential significance. About 30 minutes after his conversation with Sarah, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the passengers in the front of the cabin had gotten up to use the restroom, but instead of walking directly to the lavatory, he was moving slowly down the aisle, appearing to study the other passengers and the aircraft's interior layout. The man was tall, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and wearing a casual business outfit that helped him blend in with other travelers. But his behavior was anything but casual. He was memorizing seat numbers, noting the positions of flight attendants, and paying particular attention to the cockpit door. Marcus watched through the small monitor that displayed the cabin area as the man finally entered the restroom. But instead of the quick visit that most passengers made, he remained inside for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally emerged, he didn't return directly to his seat. Instead, he stopped to examine the emergency exit rows, running his fingers along the door mechanisms as if testing their operation. The man's actions were subtle enough that most passengers and even some flight attendants might not notice them. But to Marcus, who was now hyper-aware of every unusual behavior, the man's conduct screamed surveillance and preparation. Marcus activated the discreet call button that would summon the senior flight attendant to the cockpit. Within moments, Patricia appeared at the cockpit door. "Yes, Captain?" she asked. "Patricia, I need you to do something for me without being obvious about it," Marcus said quietly. "The passenger in seat 4B, the tall man in the blue shirt, I want you to keep an eye on him. If he gets up again or does anything unusual, let me know immediately." Patricia's professional demeanor didn't change, but Marcus could see the concern in her eyes. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Marcus glanced toward the cabin, where he could see Sarah Mitchell still maintaining her casual passenger facade while undoubtedly monitoring the same man who had caught his attention. "Just being cautious," Marcus replied, "but I want all crew members to be extra alert for the rest of the flight." The next hour of the flight passed with excruciating tension. Marcus found himself constantly glancing at the cabin monitor, watching for any sign of unusual activity from the man in seat 4B or any other passengers. His hands gripped the controls more tightly than usual, and he had to consciously remind himself to maintain normal flying procedures. Jennifer noticed his increased tension, but attributed it to typical flight stress. "Weather looks good all the way into Miami," she commented, trying to make casual conversation. "Should have us on the ground right on schedule." Marcus nodded, but his mind wasn't focused on weather or schedules. Through the cabin monitor, he could see Sarah Mitchell maintaining her cover as a regular passenger, but he noticed subtle changes in her positioning. She had shifted in her seat to get a better view of the suspicious passenger, and her magazine had been set aside entirely. Her professional training was clearly kicking in. The man in 4B had returned to his seat after his extended restroom visit, but his behavior continued to be troubling. He wasn't reading, sleeping, or engaging with any entertainment like typical passengers. Instead, he appeared to be timing something, checking his watch at regular intervals and observing the flight attendants' routines. About halfway through the flight, the situation took a more serious turn. The man in 4B got up again, this time heading toward the back of the aircraft. But instead of going to the rear lavatories, he stopped at row 18 and began talking quietly with another passenger, a woman in her 40s, who had been sitting alone and had seemed nervous throughout the flight. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language suggested this wasn't a casual chat between strangers. The woman kept glancing around nervously while the man appeared to be giving her some kind of instructions or information. After a few minutes, the man returned to his seat, and the woman remained visibly agitated. This was exactly the kind of coordination that security experts had warned about in post-9/11 training sessions. Terrorists often traveled separately and made contact during flights to avoid detection during security screening. The possibility that Marcus was witnessing the activation of a terrorist cell made his mouth go dry with fear. He activated the call button for Patricia again, and she appeared at the cockpit door within seconds. "Patricia, I need you to find a reason to walk through the cabin and pay special attention to the passenger in 18A, the woman by the window. Look for anything unusual, but don't make it obvious that you're watching her." Patricia's experience showed in her immediate understanding that this wasn't a routine request. "I'll do a safety check and offer drinks," she said. "That will give me a reason to interact with everyone." As Patricia moved through the cabin with a drink cart, Marcus watched the interactions carefully. The woman in 18A appeared increasingly nervous, declining offers of beverages and avoiding eye contact with the flight attendant. When Patricia reached the front of the cabin near the suspicious man in 4B, He also seemed agitated, checking his watch more frequently and looking around the cabin with what appeared to be growing anxiety. Marcus made a critical decision. He needed to alert air traffic control about the potential security situation without causing panic among passengers or alerting the suspected terrorists. Using the aircraft's communication system, he contacted Miami Approach Control with a carefully coded message. Miami Approach, this is United 847. We're requesting priority handling for arrival. We have a medical situation developing that may require ground support upon landing. The controller's response was immediate and professional. United 847, understand you have a medical emergency. We'll have emergency services standing by. Are you declaring an emergency? Marcus chose his words carefully. Not at this time, Miami. But we would appreciate having security personnel available at the gate upon arrival. The medical situation may require additional assistance. Experienced air traffic controllers were trained to read between the lines of such communications. By mentioning security personnel in connection with a medical situation, Marcus was signaling a potential security threat without using language that might alert anyone monitoring radio communications. United 847, we copy. Security and medical personnel will be standing by at Gate A7. Continue normal approach procedures unless you advise otherwise. With ground support now alerted, Marcus turned his attention back to the cabin situation. Sarah Mitchell had apparently picked up on the increased tension as well. She had moved from her original seat to an aisle seat several rows back, claiming she needed to stretch her legs when questioned by nearby passengers. Her new position gave her better oversight of both suspicious passengers and quicker access to intervene if necessary. The flight attendant call button chimed, and Marcus saw that the signal was coming from row 18, the nervous woman's row. Patricia responded immediately, and Marcus watched through the monitor as the woman appeared to be asking about something urgently. Patricia listened for a moment, then headed quickly toward the cockpit. Captain, Patricia said as she reached the cockpit door, her voice carefully controlled but tense. The passenger in 18A is asking about the flight's arrival time and whether there might be any delays. She seems very concerned about timing. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. Timing concerns were often indicators of coordinated terrorist activities. If the woman was part of a planned attack, she might be waiting for a specific time or trying to coordinate with accomplices on the ground. Did she say why the timing was important? Marcus asked. She mentioned something about a connecting flight, but when I offered to help her with rebooking if we're late, she became very agitated and said she didn't need help. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in a way that terrified Marcus. Two passengers who had made contact during the flight, both showing signs of extreme nervousness, both concerned about timing. It looked exactly like the scenario that air marshal training had prepared Sarah to handle. Marcus needed to make another decision quickly. They were still 90 minutes from Miami, which gave potential terrorists plenty of time to carry out whatever they might be planning. But they were also too far from any alternate airports to divert without raising suspicions. Looking at the cabin monitor, Marcus saw that Sarah had moved again, this time positioning herself where she could observe both suspicious passengers simultaneously. Her casual passenger demeanor was gone, replaced by the alert posture of a law enforcement professional preparing for action. Marcus activated the intercom system for a cabin-wide announcement, hoping to gather more information about passenger behavior through their reactions to his words. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet with excellent weather conditions. Our estimated arrival time in Miami remains on schedule at 3:47 p.m. Flight attendants will be coming through the cabin shortly with a final beverage service. We ask that you please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened during this service for everyone's safety. Marcus watched the cabin monitor carefully as his announcement played. Most passengers showed normal reactions. Some checked their watches, others simply continued with their activities. But both the man in 4B and the woman in 18A had noticeably strong reactions to his mention of the arrival time. The woman appeared to write something down, while the man reached for what looked like a cell phone, before apparently remembering that cell service wasn't available at altitude. These reactions confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Something was definitely planned for their arrival in Miami, and he was now certain that he was dealing with a coordinated threat involving multiple passengers. The question now was what to do about it. Sarah was trained for exactly this kind of situation, but Marcus knew that air marshal protocols typically involved waiting until terrorists made their move before intervening. The problem was that if these passengers were planning something for arrival or immediately after landing, waiting might be too late to prevent it. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He was going to break protocol and actively seek more information, even if it meant revealing that the crew was aware of the suspicious activity. Marcus knew he was about to cross a line that could either save lives or create a dangerous situation if he was wrong about the passengers. But his instincts, honed by years of military service and commercial flying, told him that waiting for these suspected terrorists to make their move might be too late. He turned to Jennifer, who had been monitoring their approach path to Miami. "Jen, I need you to take control of the aircraft. I'm going to do another cabin check." Jennifer looked surprised. "Another one? Marcus, you seem really on edge today. Is everything okay?" Marcus realized he couldn't continue to keep his co-pilot in the dark if he was going to take more direct action. "There's a potential security situation developing in the cabin. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to be ready for anything. If I give you any unusual instructions over the intercom, follow them immediately without question." Jennifer's professional demeanor sharpened instantly. Years of aviation training had prepared her for various emergency scenarios, and she understood that security threats were among the most serious situations they could face. "Understood, Captain. I'll monitor everything from here and be ready to assist however you need." Marcus left the cockpit and walked into the cabin with purpose. This time he wasn't trying to be subtle or casual. He moved directly toward row 4, where the suspicious man was sitting. As he approached, he could see Sarah Mitchell in his peripheral vision, subtly shifting her position to provide backup if needed. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said to the man in 4B using his most authoritative captain's voice. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I need to speak with you privately for a moment." The man looked up with surprise that seemed genuine, but Marcus noticed his hands immediately moving to secure something in his jacket pocket. "Is there a problem, Captain?" "I'd prefer to discuss this away from other passengers," Marcus replied. "Could you please come with me to the front of the aircraft?" For a moment, the man hesitated, and Marcus could see him calculating his options. Finally, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Of course, Captain. Whatever you need." As they walked toward the front of the cabin, Marcus was acutely aware of Sarah Mitchell watching their every move. He was also conscious of the other passengers, most of whom were now paying attention to the unusual sight of the captain personally escorting someone through the aircraft. Marcus led the man to the small galley area at the front of the cabin, where they could speak with relative privacy. Patricia was there organizing supplies, and Marcus gave her a subtle nod to remain close by. "Sir, I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers," Marcus began. "What is your name and what is your business in Miami?" The man's demeanor shifted noticeably. The casual passenger facade disappeared, replaced by something more guarded and alert. "My name is David Chen. I'm a software consultant traveling to Miami for business meetings." "And what is your relationship with the passenger in seat 18A?" This question clearly caught David off guard. His eyes widened slightly, and Marcus could see him struggling with how to respond. "I'm sorry, Captain, but I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anyone on this flight." Marcus had spent enough time interrogating personnel during his military service to recognize when someone was lying. David's body language, his tone of voice, and his obvious discomfort all indicated deception. "Mr. Chen, I observed you having an extended conversation with the woman in 18A about 30 minutes ago. I also noticed both of you showing unusual interest in flight timing and crew routines. I'm going to ask you one more time. What is your connection to that passenger?" David's face had gone pale, and he was clearly struggling with his response. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. "Captain, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Yes, I spoke with that woman, but not for the reason you're thinking." "What reason am I thinking, Mr. Chen? You obviously suspect some kind of security threat. But you're wrong about what's happening here." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and continued suspicion. If David wasn't a terrorist, then what was he? And why had his behavior been so suspicious? "Then explain to me what is happening here," Marcus demanded. David glanced around the galley area, then leaned closer to Marcus and lowered his voice. "Captain, I work for the Department of Homeland Security. I'm an undercover air marshal." Marcus felt like he had been hit by lightning. Another air marshal? That would mean there were 2 federal law enforcement officers on his aircraft, both working undercover, possibly without knowing about each other. "Do you have identification to prove that?" Marcus asked. David reached into his jacket pocket and produced a badge and identification card similar to what Sarah had shown him earlier. "Federal Air Marshal David Chen, Department of Homeland Security. The woman in 18A is not a terrorist, Captain. She's a federal prosecutor who's been receiving death threats related to a case she's working on in Miami. I'm on this flight specifically to provide protection for her." The revelation completely changed Marcus's understanding of the situation. Instead of witnessing terrorist coordination, he had been watching a federal air marshal doing his job, monitoring his protectee and checking timing to ensure her safe arrival. "Why didn't you identify yourself earlier when I first noticed your unusual behavior?" Marcus asked. "Because air marshals are supposed to remain completely invisible unless there's an actual emergency," David replied. "Our effectiveness depends on no one knowing we're on board, including flight crews. I was hoping to complete this assignment without anyone noticing my presence." Marcus realized he had stumbled into a complex federal law enforcement operation, but it also raised new questions about Sarah Mitchell and what she was really doing on this flight. "Mr. Chen, are you aware of any other federal agents on this aircraft?" Marcus asked carefully. David's expression became even more serious. "What do you mean, Captain? Are you saying there's someone else?" Before Marcus could respond, he noticed Sarah Mitchell approaching their position at the front of the cabin. She moved with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, and Marcus realized she must have overheard enough of their conversation to know that her cover had been blown. "Gentlemen," Sarah said quietly, as she joined them in the galley area, "I think we need to have a more complete conversation." David's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon when he saw Sarah approaching, but he stopped when Marcus held up a calming hand. "David Chen, meet Sarah Mitchell," Marcus said. "Sarah, this is David. It appears we have 2 air marshals on the same flight." The look of surprise on both agents' faces was genuine and concerning. David and Sarah stared at each other, with the kind of professional assessment that law enforcement officers use when encountering unexpected colleagues in the field. "I wasn't briefed about any other federal agents on this flight," David said. "Carefully, neither was I," Sarah replied. "My assignment came through standard air marshal protocols based on intelligence about potential threats to Denver-Miami routes." Marcus felt a growing sense of unease. If 2 different federal agencies had independently assigned protection to the same flight without coordinating with each other, it suggested that the threat level might be much higher than either agent had been told. "Could both of your assignments be related to the same underlying threat?" Marcus asked. Sarah and David exchanged glances, clearly thinking through the implications. "It's possible," Sarah said. "Intelligence sometimes gets compartmentalized for security reasons. Different agencies might respond to the same threat without knowing about each other's involvement. Or," David added grimly, "there might be multiple threats that we're not fully aware of." The possibility that his aircraft was the target of multiple, unrelated security concerns made Marcus's blood run cold. But before he could process this information further, Patricia appeared at the edge of the galley area with an expression of urgent concern. "Captain," she said quietly, "we have a problem in the back of the cabin. The passenger in 32C has been trying to access the rear emergency exit. When I approached him, he became very agitated and demanded to know exactly when we would be landing." Marcus, Sarah, and David all exchanged grim looks. A third suspicious passenger, acting independently of the others, suggested that the threat to their flight was much more serious than any of them had initially realized. "Show me," Sarah said to Patricia, immediately assuming her law enforcement role. As they moved toward the back of the cabin, Marcus noticed that several passengers were becoming aware that something unusual was happening. The sight of the captain, a flight attendant, and 2 passengers having intense conversations was beginning to attract attention. The passenger in 32C was a middle-aged man with nervous energy, who had been largely unremarkable during most of the flight. But now, as Marcus observed him more closely, he could see signs of extreme agitation. The man was sweating despite the comfortable cabin temperature, and his movements were jerky and erratic. "Sir," Sarah said as they approached row 32, speaking in the calm but authoritative tone of a federal agent, I understand you've been having some concerns about the emergency exit. Is there something I can help you with? But the man had already grabbed something from his bag. Not a weapon, as Marcus had feared, but a cell phone. I have to call them, he said desperately. I have to tell them the plane is going to be late. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't a terrorist trying to attack the aircraft. This was someone who was supposed to communicate flight timing information to people on the ground. People who might be planning to use that information for something terrible. The man's desperate confession about needing to call them with timing information sent chills through everyone within earshot. Sarah and David immediately moved to secure him, while Marcus realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple terrorist threat on board the aircraft. Sir, I need you to put the phone down and sit back in your seat, Sarah said firmly, positioning herself to block any attempt the man might make to move toward the emergency exit. You don't understand, the man replied, his voice rising with panic. If I don't call them, people are going to die. They're waiting at the airport, and if they don't know exactly when we're landing. David stepped forward and gently but firmly took the cell phone from the man's trembling hands. What's your name, sir? Robert. Robert Martinez, the man stammered. I work for airport security in Miami. 3 days ago, some men approached me and threatened my family if I didn't provide them with exact arrival information for this flight. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place for Marcus. Robert wasn't a terrorist. He was a victim being coerced into providing intelligence to people who were planning something at Miami International Airport. The real threat wasn't on the aircraft at all, but waiting for them on the ground. Sarah and David exchanged knowing looks. This scenario fit exactly with the type of sophisticated terrorist planning that security agencies had been monitoring since 9/11. Instead of trying to attack aircraft in flight, terrorists had increasingly focused on ground-based operations that could be coordinated with specific flight arrivals. Robert, Sarah said gently but urgently, I need you to tell me everything about these men who threatened your family. What exactly did they want you to do? Robert's composure collapsed entirely. They wanted me to call them with the exact landing time when we were 30 minutes out from Miami. They said they had people positioned around the airport, and if I didn't provide the information, they would hurt my wife and daughter. Marcus felt his responsibility as pilot in command weighing heavily on him. Not only did he have 147 passengers and crew members whose safety was his direct responsibility, but now he was learning that their arrival might trigger a terrorist attack that could harm many more people on the ground. Did they tell you what they were planning to do with the timing information? David asked. Robert shook his head. No, they just said they needed to know exactly when Flight 847 from Denver would be at the gate. They gave me a phone number to call and told me that my family's safety depended on my cooperation. Sarah was already thinking several steps ahead. Captain Rodriguez, we need to contact ground authorities immediately if there's a coordinated attack planned for our arrival. Miami International needs to implement emergency security protocols. Marcus nodded, but he was also thinking about the immediate safety of his aircraft and passengers. We also need to consider whether we should divert to an alternate airport. If we're expected at Miami at a specific time, changing our arrival location might disrupt whatever they're planning. That's a good point, David agreed. But we also need to consider that diverting might put us into a worse situation if they have backup plans for other airports. The conversation was interrupted by Patricia, who appeared with a concerned expression. Captain, some of the passengers are getting nervous about all the activity back here. They're starting to ask questions about what's happening. Marcus realized they needed to move quickly. If word spread through the cabin that there was a security situation, it could create panic that would make their job much more difficult. At the same time, they needed to coordinate with ground authorities and make critical decisions about how to handle the threat. Robert, Sarah said, I need you to give me that phone number. We're going to use this information to help law enforcement identify and stop these people. Robert nodded and provided the number, which David immediately wrote down. What about my family? Robert asked desperately. If I don't call them, what's going to happen to my wife and daughter? We're going to make sure your family is safe, David assured him. Federal agents are probably already moving to protect them based on the security alerts that have been issued. Marcus made a decision. I'm going back to the cockpit to contact air traffic control and coordinate with ground authorities. Sarah, David, I need you both to maintain order in the cabin and be ready for anything when we land. As Marcus walked back toward the cockpit, his mind was racing with the implications of what they had discovered. The original intelligence about threats to Denver-Miami flights had been accurate, but it hadn't revealed the full scope of the planned attack. Instead of hijackers on board, they were dealing with a ground-based terrorist cell that was planning to use their arrival as the trigger for something much larger. Returning to the cockpit, Marcus found Jennifer monitoring their approach to Miami airspace. Jen, we have a major situation developing. I'm going to contact air traffic control with an emergency declaration. Jennifer's training kicked in immediately. What do you need me to do? Continue flying the aircraft normally, but be prepared for immediate course changes or emergency procedures. We may need to divert to an alternate airport or implement non-standard arrival procedures. Marcus activated the emergency frequency and contacted air traffic control. Miami approach United 847 declaring a security emergency. We have confirmed intelligence about a coordinated ground threat at Miami International Airport. Time to our arrival. The response was immediate and professional. United 847, we copy your security emergency. Stand by for instructions from federal authorities. Within minutes, Marcus was in contact with FBI agents, Department of Homeland Security officials, and airport security coordinators. The information from Robert Martinez had triggered a massive law enforcement response at Miami International Airport. Teams were being deployed to identify and neutralize the terrorist cell that was waiting for their arrival. But the authorities also presented Marcus with a difficult choice. They could divert to Fort Lauderdale or Orlando, which would disrupt the terrorists' timing but might also alert them that their plan had been discovered. Alternatively, they could continue to Miami, but land at a secure area of the airport where law enforcement could monitor and control the situation. After consulting with Sarah and David, Marcus chose a third option that none of them had initially considered. They would continue to Miami as scheduled, but they would delay their arrival by exactly 30 minutes, the window when Robert was supposed to make his phone call. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. By arriving 30 minutes late, they would pass the deadline for Robert's call without alerting the terrorists to the fact that their plan had been discovered. This would give law enforcement additional time to identify and apprehend the terrorist cell, while maintaining the element of surprise. As they approached Miami airspace, Marcus could see increased security activity at the airport below. Emergency vehicles were positioned strategically around the terminal, and he could make out what appeared to be federal agents in tactical gear, monitoring the arrival gates. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Marcus announced over the intercom. "We've encountered some air traffic delays that will put us about 30 minutes behind schedule. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause." The announcement was met with the typical passenger grumbling about delays. But Marcus knew that those 30 minutes might save countless lives. As they touched down at Miami International Airport and taxied toward the gate, Marcus could see through the cockpit window that law enforcement had successfully apprehended several individuals in the terminal area. The coordinated ground attack that had been planned for their arrival had been prevented. After bringing the aircraft to a complete stop at the gate, Marcus made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Miami. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off and the aircraft has come to a complete stop." But as passengers began to disembark, Marcus knew that this flight would be remembered not for its on-time arrival or smooth flying conditions, but for the moment when a simple observation about a patch on a uniform had helped prevent a terrorist attack that could have changed everything.